Hello and welcome to the Lib Dem Podcast. My name is John Potter and today we are going to be talking about UBI. It is coming up in our conference that is coming up very soon and a motion has been put forward that the party adopt it and campaign more strongly for it. Now with me we have two people who are strongly in favour. Now, what's interesting is I'm not entirely convinced. So as someone who isn't against the policy, but thinks maybe needs a bit of reassurance that this is the way to go. So we'll see if these guys can actually convince me, which I'm sure they probably will. So first up, as all of you probably know, we have Jane Dodds, the former MEP for Brecon and Radnorshire. We were all there last year fighting those hills and those garden fences and large farming drives. So welcome, Jane.
Thanks very much, John. Great to be here, and thanks very much for this opportunity. And thank you very much as well for coming over to Brecon and Radnorshire as well, and for at least we didn't lose you at the farm track. I'm still convinced that we haven't got all our members back, so maybe one day we'll find them, but glad you're back from some of those farm tracks.
It was one of those things on the way back. It was, I realised I'd been driving for 2 hours and I was still in the constituency. But also I'd like to introduce Peter Sloman, who is an academic involved with UBI. So Peter, welcome to the podcast.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for having me on. I'm really interested to talk about it with you.
So actually, Peter, should we start with yourself? So what's your background in terms of why do you support UBI before we go into the actual conference motion?
Thanks. That's a good question. I guess I have been interested in basic income for about 10 years, mainly from a historical perspective. That about 11 years ago, I came across basic income proposals. I came across some in the 1940s, which I'll talk about in a minute. I came across some in contemporary political debates, though basic income very much wasn't on the UK political agenda 10 years ago in the way that it is now. And I set about, as a historian, really trying to link these things up. There's been a lot of interest in basic income over the last century in British politics, but it wasn't something that was really recognised in the historical literature or the social policy literature. So I went to try and stitch this story together. And what I found was that basic income has come on and off the political agenda. I guess particularly at times of real uncertainty about the future of the labour market, real concern about poverty and insecurity. And I think it's fascinating that basic income is back on the agenda, and Liberal Democrats are once again at the forefront of taking the idea seriously and thinking about how you can turn it into a policy.
I suppose, Jane, you are the summator of the policy motion that is going to conference. So you'll have the job of all the people that are speaking against it, of rebutting their arguments. So why are you part of this policy motion? Why is it so important to you?
So I can't claim to have the length of time of interest that Peter's had, but I guess about 4 years ago, I started reading about it, and the first thing I thought was, what a bonkers idea. That is just absolutely mad. What on earth is that about, that everybody gets exactly the same? It doesn't matter if they're a millionaire or somebody on benefits. I thought that is just a crazy idea. And somebody just said to me, okay, well, just read about it. And I did. And the more I read about it, the more I thought, okay, this deserves a bit of exploration. And then I started to look at some of the pilots and saw some of the results of the pilots, and became more convinced actually that it was a liberal idea. It was very much entrenched in what I believe liberal philosophy and ideals are about. So that's where it came from for me. And I guess where I'm at now is that with COVID-19 and the period of time we've been in, it's become even more apparent that we must push this forward as a society. So, yeah, that's where I'm at the moment.
And as context, I don't think, other than I think the Scottish Green Party are in favour of UBI, but I mean, Peter, you probably know more than I do. No other party has yet adopted it as an official policy. Is that correct?
I think it's currently Green Party policy. I think it is taken very seriously by elements within the SNP, particularly at council level, though possibly there is more commitment to exploring it than necessarily introducing it there. No, it's something that has been Liberal policy and Liberal Democrat policy in the past. So generally, it's been Liberals and Greens who have been most enthusiastic.
So why? I mean, under Corbyn, we have seen when Layla first announced she may be in favour of this, and I think then Ed has come on saying they both are interested in looking at pilots of UBI. And a lot of kind of the Corbynista left of Labour said, oh, yes, this is fantastic. Why haven't Labour then adopted this as one of their key planks?
I mean, I guess there are conflicting strands within the Labour Party in how Labour people think about poverty. Obviously, there are lots of people in the Labour Party who are deeply committed to social justice and deeply committed to the idea that everybody should have enough to live on. But I guess the clue is in the name. This is also a party with very deep links to the trade union movement. Historically, the trade unions have been very suspicious of anything that might undermine the centrality of paid work as the foundation of people's economic security. There's been a lot of fear that if you give people a basic income, obviously depending on the level, that might discourage people from joining unions and make it harder for unions to make the argument that they need a living wage, that they need wages to be high enough for people to live on and raise a family on. Of course, the trade unions were also, in the 1920s and 30s, very hostile to what is now child benefit. So there's a long history of deep ambivalence within the labour movement about how far the state should get involved in supporting people in poverty, unless they're in particular categories of deservingness, like the unemployed and the retired. Obviously, Liberals are supportive of trade unions, and much of the basic income movement today sees UBI as a way of strengthening workers' ability to bargain for higher wages, because it would enable people to say no to exploitative employers and not have to settle for whatever wages are available. But I guess Liberals are more willing, perhaps, to say, how can we decouple people's basic economic security from their ability to earn a particular wage in the labour market?
So UBI has been trialled in various places. I mean, Finland is probably the one that a lot of people mention, but none of them have been kind of taken up as a long-term policy. The trials have been, I don't know if the Finland trial has actually been fully assessed yet. I do know the Finnish government was doing quite a long assessment over it, so I don't know if that assessment has finished. But I mean, Jay, how then can we put ourselves forward for it if we are not sure yet, if the people that have trialled it have yet to do so?
I think that's a really good question, isn't it, really? And there's always this kind of debate about trials and pilots. So, being clear what a trial is and being clear what a pilot is. So pilot to me is a time-limited, focused application of a program. In our case, it would be UBI. A trial is something that says we've adopted this and we are just trying out its implementation and learning what we need to put in place or change or kind of improve or remove in terms of implementing it finally. So there's been lots of, as you say, there's been lots of pilots of universal basic income. Finland is the most well known because it's been the most recent. But there have been many, many other pilots, or you could even say trials, around the globe that have gone on and on over the kind of past 30 or 40 years. I mean, if we look at the one in Dauphin, outside Manitoba in Canada, that went on for 4 years, from 1970 to 1974. What didn't happen there was that there wasn't a kind of systematic evaluation of that at the time. So they didn't deliberately set out to evaluate it, but retrospectively, they have evaluated it and they have had, really kind of positive outcomes from that, which have matched things like what happened in the Finnish trial as well. So we're wanting us to look at a trial. That's what we're wanting. We're wanting us to say, let's adopt it as a principle. There's lots of issues around funding it and how what the income is set at, but we want to trial it to look at how we can then apply it. And can I just add one last thing? People say, what's the point of the Liberal Democrat passing a motion? Because you're never going to be in government. What a ridiculous idea. You might as well just say everybody should have £1,000 a month, and we'll all say, yeah, that's a brilliant idea, or £1,000 a day, fantastic, because you're never going to be in government. What I think Liberals and Liberal Democrats need to remember, and this is what I hold fast to why I'm a Liberal Democrat, is that we have pushed the debate in other parties along. That's what we've done. So we have very much been part of setting the scene in many, many things. Which haven't meant that we've needed to be in power, but that we've pushed the debate. So you asked about the Labour Party. So if we start talking about this and hopefully adopt this motion, then I hope people in the Labour Party, for instance, will sit up and start taking notice, and potentially, they may be in government, we hope soon. And who knows, maybe the Conservative Party might sit up and take notice as well. Let's see.
So two questions kind of come up from what you've just read that come up a lot when people debate UBIs. A, the cost. And it is a substantial cost, whichever kind of way you cut it, it does seem to be a huge cost. And you've also mentioned the Canadian model. And one of the articles that assessed at the end said, for basic income to work on a larger scale, governments would need to find an eligibility income threshold that is reasonable enough to cover necessities, but then not allow people to live the good life on its own. So they are some of the two things. At what level do you set it, and how can you afford it? Now, Peter, and there will be fundamental questions to what most people think when it comes to UBI.
Sure. That's absolutely right. The idea of basic income can take on very different meanings depending on the level that you're setting it at. I think almost everybody who's looked at it has said that if you were to try to replace the entirety of the UK welfare system and ensure that the people who are getting most out of the current system don't lose out, so for instance, set it at a level that is equivalent to the most extensive forms of support for low-income families with children through the tax credit system, or people who are disabled and have special needs provisions, then that would be unaffordably expensive. It would take a very large share of national income. So I think the question is what kind of basic income you can afford, and whether that is worthwhile. Now, actually, if you look at the proposals which Liberals have supported in the past, whether this is in 1950, when the Liberal Party was committed to it, or in the 1970s, or again in the early 1990s when Paddy Ashdown and Ed Davey actually were involved in designing a Lib Dem basic income policy, the approach that was normally taken was to basically replace the personal income tax allowance with a basic income. Effectively, that would mean that if you're earning, what is the personal allowance now, about £12,500 a year, if you're earning that, you would get a basic income that would effectively cover your tax liability up to that level. You'd be in the same position as you are at the minute. Now, that would mean a basic income of somewhere between £50 and £70 per person per week. Not enough to live on, but a substantial sum of money, a kind of starting point that people could build on through earning or through saving or in other ways. And because you would be replacing the income tax allowances with that, that would sharply reduce the cost. There would still be some cost because you'd be paying that to people who don't earn as much as £12,000 a year. And so the question would be how you would fill the rest of that financial gap. Ed Davey has suggested you could set up a sovereign wealth fund and turn some of the loans which the government has made during the pandemic to companies into shares and use the dividends from those shares to help pay a UBI. That's an idea with a very long tradition going back through James Mead and the Social Democratic Party in the 1980s. I guess you could also raise taxes. Last year's Lib Dem manifesto proposed to raise about £16 billion a year from increases in corporation tax and capital gains tax, which are not tax increases that would hit ordinary working people or the vast majority of voters. If you wanted to, if you thought this was your spending priority, you could use those kind of tax increases to make basic income affordable.
Can I just add to that really quickly? Is that all right? So I think absolutely asking about what it costs is what it's all about. I think there's something else to throw in there as well. So if we look at the studies and the pilots, particularly from Finland and from the one I mentioned earlier in Dauphin, what also happened was that people's mental health improved. That is, they didn't use mental health services to the degree that had been used before. And some of the studies, particularly in the Canadian kind of program, found that hospitalization decreased as well. That is, for physical ailments decreased as well. So although we talk all the time, and it is really important about what it costs to pay everybody this basic income, what we must also start to think about is factoring in what it could save us in our services. Now, I know we can't really do that because you can't really assign it to an individual, but we mustn't forget that principle, that actually what it has resulted in is increased mental health, decreased hospitalization, and improved educational attainment. So if we look at all of those three things together, they actually save money in terms of our infrastructure and our spending on local services, as well as, of course, which is fundamentally what a liberal idea is all about, as well as giving people the power and the opportunity to make choices to improve their lives. And that's something we must look at in terms of the costs as well.
And I think some of the argument against it is people who generally don't like universality. People who are always against, say, a universal benefit such as the free TV license or free bus passes to the elderly. They get it automatically because you'll get, and I'm sure you'll get it on the conference floor when you debate this. They'll say, do we really want to give X amount of million to people who don't need it? And I suppose your counter argument to that would be, well, you could do what kind of Gordon Brown tried to do and try and find some perfect system that ended up having so many loopholes, knots and ring rounds and all the rest of it that people who wanted to scam the system could, but then people who needed the system sometimes didn't know where to go. Is that the kind of the crux of it, that the universality is key because it's simple?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, if you're a policy wonk and you're sitting there with a spreadsheet, then targeted benefits like tax credits and universal credit look like a really efficient and effective way of raising people above a poverty line and dealing with that problem. But we've seen with tax credits, as you say, and we've seen with universal credit, that trying to target money on those in narrowly on those with low incomes can be enormously destabilizing. It can create a poverty trap so that it isn't worth them earning more money or taking better jobs. It can create all kinds of punitive sanctions regimes because you're trying to make sure that people aren't exploiting these kind of systems. And people don't know what they're going to get each month. Now, obviously, it may not be possible to pay a basic income that removes the need for those kind of targeted benefits altogether, but you could substantially reduce people's dependence on them. And as Jane says, all the evidence from the studies that have been held in other countries is that can have a transformative effect on people's mental health and their ability to function and flourish.
I'm going to dive in again, if I may, just there on the universality issue of it all. People have universal services now. People have a universal health service, universal education service. We have that principle thankfully adopted in the UK right now, and that can be used by rich or poor. and it doesn't really matter. People who are rich may choose to use private health, use private education, but nevertheless we have those services there. And if we start getting into that, then we can start saying, okay, we'll start wanting top-ups from you then. If you want to pay more, and if you're earning more, then let's get a top-up from you for your education, let's get a top-up from you for your health services. Now we don't say that, and actually, you know, this also kind of gets into a moral debate about who deserves it and who doesn't. You know, who's there to make a judgment, if you like, that, you know, you actually don't deserve it. We don't want to get into that, and that's not very liberal either. So yeah, it is. You know, it is exactly what it says on the tin. It's universal. Everybody has it. It's basic, because it's there to keep you off poverty. I say, if the aim is to close the food banks, it's worth it. And it's an income, it's cash. It's absolutely cash. It's not a voucher scheme. It's not, you can spend it here, there and everywhere. It's absolutely cash for you to have the freedom to do with it what you want.
I think, I can't remember which, I think it might have even been Nick Clegg when we were talking about the poverty line, etc., when he said poverty plus £5 is still poverty. And that was the kind of the line he used to use about when Labour was messing around with where you set these strata to get people. Now, regarding the actual motion itself, now it's got one of the criticisms that might come of it is that there's no facts and figures in it. And I completely get that you've only got 69 lines of text in it because it's a policy motion. What do you, if this is successful, what do you expect the next stages to be? Because obviously such a huge issue, such a massive policy as this is going to need a lot of workings, even for a trial or a pilot or anything like that. It's going to need a lot of work done beforehand. So what would be the next step if you are successful?
Yeah, so I'll respond to that. So it is about an in-principle decision. This is about us adopting a position on universal basic income and being very clear that we want this to then go forward to work up the policy and look at the facts and figures. We also appreciate that right now in COVID-19 time, and we still are when the conference is going to be held, the economic state of the country is quite fragile. So we need to be recognising that when we get to a point for the next conference, that we hope things will be a little bit clearer. Now, people may say that's a cop-out, but actually what this is about is taking it in two stages. We want to adopt a principle, and then we want it worked up into facts and figures and where we're going to get the money from as well. So it is really, it is a giant leap for liberal personkind to adopt this. And, we will be, apart from the Green Party, we will be the other national party in the UK to have adopted this. So it's really important. It's progressive, it's radical, it's different, it's simple, it's very clear. And there are lots of people who we want to talk this through with, who we want to listen to, who will be sceptical, will, have lots of questions. And that's exactly why we want to start this debate, just concentrating on universal basic income. Don't forget, it's been part of some other discussions in the Liberal Party over many years, over a decade or so, but this motion is solely about universal basic income.
And Peter, I wonder if I can bring you in. I think what COVID has brought up is maybe the need for this sort of system going forward. I'm sure that lots of people would argue that. There are lots of concerns about workforce going forward, about how you deal with automation, and such a massive state intervention that we've had right now, where you have a lot of people, and I know this isn't kind of a woe is me kind of point, that, I am one of the excluded kind of sole traders that has received nothing from the government whatsoever, no help whatsoever. I had 95% of my income go. Is it time that we actually start to think, when things like this happen, is the time for Liberal Democrats to be brave enough to say something fundamentally has to change with this system?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think in any Western society, the question is, how are how are most people going to have their living standards met over the coming years? And I guess since the 1980s, the way in which the British government has tried to deal with, I guess, the problems of deindustrialization and the decline of trade unions and the decline of manufacturing industry has been by creating as many service sector jobs as possible, often in the gig economy, often quite short term, often quite casual, encouraging self-employment, and then using the welfare system with a kind of carrot and stick approach to get people into those jobs. So using benefit sanctions to sort of force people to look for work, using tax credits and other kind of benefit systems to top people's wages up and make that work pay. And I think there are really deep questions as to whether that is a sustainable model, either in the short term or in the long term. I mean, I think the assumption that underpinned a lot of that, particularly among people like Gordon Brown, was the belief that it was somehow a kind of deep moral good, that people should go out to work, that it was better for them. You know, the last thing you wanted was people sitting at home all day, and that when they went into work, this is the so-called kind of work first philosophy, that whatever job you start off in, that simply being in the labour market and getting used to keeping time, being disciplined and so on, you would then move up the ladder within the labour market. Now, the second of those assumptions has basically been proven wrong over the last 30 years because we have a productivity crisis, because we have a lot of people who have gone into low-wage jobs and got stuck there because companies haven't had incentives to help them move up to better paid work. And it's been hard for people to take time out of the labour market to retrain and upskill in the way that we would really want them to. In the context of a pandemic, the first of those assumptions is also problematic. That actually having people stay at home right now is a public health good, despite what Rishi Sunak is trying to get people to do by go out and have dinners on Monday, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays. And so I think we really need to rethink our assumptions about what the relationship between work and welfare and people's well-being is going to be in the 2020s. And I think there's a lot to be said for putting basic income in the mix as part of the solution to moving on, not just from COVID, but from the insecurity and instability that a lot of people have faced over the last 20 years in a labour market that hasn't really worked for them.
Can I add something to that as well? Sorry,
yeah. No.
I'm taking us right back to those farm tracks, I'm afraid, John, and kind of. So, I live in a rural area here in Mid Wales, and farmers, contrary to what most people believe, are actually some of the most poorly paid people in terms of their productivity and the hours that they work. And they work in an incredibly unstable market, which, week by week, the price of their product varies significantly. Welsh Hill farmers are some of the poorest out of those farmers. Their income for the past 15 years has not changed from around £10,000 a year. And what they tell me is the biggest stress factor is not knowing how much they're going to get every week because of the market fluctuating so much. And that's all they have. They don't have anything else. Some of them have diversified in order to create a basic income that they know is going to be regular and a fixed amount, going into egg production and things like that. But actually, universal basic income for farmers would be a real godsend. They would know that every week they would know how much is coming in. And if we go back to the mental health issues, for example, that we spoke about, that is really important, particularly for farmers. Farming is the profession that has the highest number of suicides per year. So, straight away, you're talking, hooking onto what Peter says, you've got an absolute clarity and simplicity around creating a program that makes sure that people know exactly how much they're going to get every week, and they can feel secure in that.
I wonder if, to kind of get this debate going full circle now, we've talked about the merits of it. Now let's talk about the politics of it. Okay, the viable politics. Is this something that we think actually the British people would swallow? Do we think that actually if Lib Dems did adopt this, is it something that, people are just going to say, because we all know that the electorate has a limited kind of attention span on politics. And if something needs to be explained, sometimes it then doesn't have the cut through. If the Tories can win with, oven ready deal, etc., or get Brexit done, do you think that there will be an appetite within the British electorate to understand what UBI means beyond the just giving loads of people cash?
I'll come in there. And Aidan Bevan perhaps thought the same about the health service. I don't know. If I could go back and speak to him, I'd say to him, how on earth, number one, did you come up with this brilliant idea? And secondly, convince everybody that actually a payment should be made in order to make sure that there was universality of healthcare. And what he did was inspire people. What he did was talk about it in really everyday terms that really made people understand that it wasn't just about, in his case, living in Tredegar, it wasn't just about miners who couldn't afford healthcare and, were dying in the most awful circumstances. But this was something that we should support as individuals. And so for me, it's about starting, to push things forward. And we've already had that. I mean, we're there isn't a week that goes by that I don't think you hear, people talking about universal basic income, whether they love it or are waiting to be convinced about it. So we're already on this journey, and COVID-19 is the ideal opportunity right now for us to push this forward. And we mustn't lose this chance. We mustn't lose the opportunity to talk about the furlough scheme. And for most people, and there were some people excluded, and it's been terrible, those people who have been excluded, like yourself, John. I think it's really important that we say this was pushed forward, this could be afforded, this was about political will that said we're going to do it, we're going to deliver it, it's going to happen, it's going to really right now we're going to make sure that this changes, and the mechanics are there to make sure that people get their income paid. So it's absolutely about inspiring, convincing, talking, questioning, possibly changing our position on some things. We've got to be open to flexibility on it, but it is absolutely about that. So the time is right now. We cannot lose this opportunity.
I hate to say, Peter, you've got to follow that, because given how good a speaker Jane is, but you're not going to be at conference. Like I say, you're not a Lib Dem member. So this is your last pitch, Peter, to what would you say to a Lib Dem member who's going to have their voting card in their hand at the virtual conference? What's your pitch to them?
I think what I would say, I've been thinking a little bit about this, because of course no political party wants to write its manifesto 4 years ahead of an election when the world might be changing. And is this the kind of policy which Boris Johnson would love to have a go at in an election campaign? Yes, probably. Maybe it is a little bit Marmite, though I know Tim Farron has said a lot about the advantages of being a Marmite politician and kind of standing out a bit. I guess what I would say is, as an outside observer, is that in the last 2 election campaigns, Lib Dems have had a lot of quite detailed policy, actually a lot of quite expensive policy proposals about investing in the NHS, investing in schools, childcare, skills wallets, I think, in the last election, and putting money into universal credit. Actually, the electorate, outside perhaps a few target seats, seems to me to have paid relatively little attention to a lot of that policy. The Lib Dems have found it quite hard to achieve cut-through in terms of policy ideas with the general public. And of course, even though many of the Lib Dems policies were very progressive, the legacy of coalition has made it hard for the Lib Dems to reach out to voters on the centre-left who might have been burned by that. So I think there is a real opportunity for the Lib Dems, if they're going to embrace basic income, to say, this is a sign that the party is going to prioritise people in need. It's going to prioritise the case for economic security, really making sure everybody has a foundation in life, and almost a way of for the party to turn the page on some of the difficulties it's had over the last few years, in the new political climate that we're moving into.
Well, I just want to finally just thank you both for coming on. Just to let everyone know that this, the policy motion in particular, is on Friday, the 25th of September at 10 to 8. So no glasses of wine in the background for you, Jane, while you're doing your summation. But also to all members, the conference is now open to registration. So if you want to vote on this, either way, whether for or against, do sign up to the virtual conference and get your registration in so you're able to vote on this, because it does feel like a big moment for the party, whether you're for it or against it, to make sure you have that say. Like I said, I just want to say thank you so much to Jane and for Peter for coming on. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Of course, you can catch up with everything to do with the Lib Dem Pod on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Lib Dem Pod. You can subscribe to us at your normal podcast provider or on YouTube. And just thank you so much. Don't forget, you can also leave comments. What do you think of this debate? Did they convince you? Were you on the fence? Have they brought you over? Let us know. But take care of yourselves, and we'll have another episode very soon.